This is Gary Hoffman with another episode of the Tarvin Family Association video series. Today we will look at the origin of Tarvins in America by discovering the first Tarvin ancestor to immigrate to America from England. If this subject is interesting to you, please click the like button on YouTube, and to be reminded when new episodes are released, click on subscribe. Before I continue, I want to be sure that I give credit where credit is due. My presentation draws heavily on the research of Vern Hoffman, Lillian Tarvin Williams, Earl Tarvin, Shirley Brown, and many others who helped bring the information together for the Tarvin Family Association. Most of what we have here is on the Tarvin Family Association website at www.tarvinfamily.org. But if you have better information on any of the people I'm talking about, we welcome your input. Please contact us. And one other thing I want to mention is that I'm going to show a lot of dates, but most of those dates are approximate because of the way we're gathering the information. In the last episode, we talked about Reverend George Tarvin and his 13 children, 12 of whom were born in the upper Potomac area of Virginia near the mouth of the Cacapon River. That area is now in West Virginia, but it's very close to Maryland and Pennsylvania. Reverend George was born in Charles County, Maryland, and he apprenticed in Fairfax County, Virginia. And then we find him in the upper Potomac area of the northern neck of Virginia among a community of Dunkers, that is, members of the Church of the Brethren, a German church, German-speaking people, and a German church, part of whom were considered the Pennsylvania Dutch. In about 1794, Reverend George, his family, and several other related families came from Pittsburgh down the Ohio River to Kentucky, where they pulled out at Limestone, now known as Maysville, Kentucky. About 100 years later, after all these people arrived in the Kentucky area, one of Reverend George's great-grandsons, Richard Johnston Tarvin, noticed, as he was going about his business, that there were many Tarvins in the northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area. So he put together and organized what he found out about Reverend George's descendants and created a Tarvin family tree in 1897. This was the beginning of genealogy research and publishing for the Tarvin family. Here's what the Tarvin family tree looked like that he created. It's a beautiful piece of art, and it depicts the family as a tree with Reverend George and, of course, his wife, Sarah Craycraft, as the trunk of the tree, and their 13 children, each as major branches off the tree. You'll see that Richard J. Tarvin also drew sub-branches and leaves, which he named for the grandchildren and perhaps some great-grandchildren that are on this tree. This tree is the original. I do not know where it is, but this is a scan of a copy, and it itself is over 130 years old. So what do we do with this tree? Well, there's a lot of information to be gleaned, but mostly there are not very many dates. So what we're doing is trying to find the relationships and using other records to find the dates of these people. Notice that Richard Johnston Tarvin put Reverend George Tarvin in England. That is, his roots are in England, according to RJT in 1897. So here's what he wrote about it. On the trunk of the tree, he said, no record of the date of his arrival from England. He settled in the vicinity of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, married Miss Craycraft, moved to the vicinity of Shannon Church, Mason County, Kentucky in 1793, and died 1810 or 1811 near Augusta, Kentucky, from injuries received in a grist mill. So for many years, this is all the information we had on George Tarvin that was published by Richard J. Tarvin, his great-grandson. So this is the way we reproduce the tree now in a kind of a descendancy format. But let's talk about let's talk about George Tarvin and his ancestry. We can now, thanks to the research by the people I mentioned earlier, determine that George Tarvin, Reverend George, was the son of another George Tarvin and his wife Eleanor Mudd, who were also American born. So George Tarvin, Reverend George, was not actually from England. It was his grandfather, Richard Tarvin, who came from England. Richard Tarvin was the immigrant and patriarch of most all the Tarvins in America. He was born in 1691 in Liverpool, England, the son of George and Marcia Tarvin. Now, we've got a lot of Georges in the family, so our researchers began calling this George, George I. Richard is the only surviving child of this family out of a total of 8 siblings. And as near as we can tell, he immigrated to America during the time frame of 1708 to 1715 when he was about 18 to 25 years old, probably with his father. Well, how did he come to America? Well, let's talk about how people in general came to America in the 1600s and 1700s. Yes, it's possible that they could pay their passage and take a ship and probably have a very good passage, but very few people actually paid their own passage. Many people came as indentured servants, that is, voluntarily, they indentured themselves to either someone who they could work for in America or to a ship's captain. These were skilled or unskilled workers, and also many people came who were military soldiers and sailors. These military people probably did not stay, but quite a few did. Then there's the category of the involuntary servants. These would include the ones who were criminally sentenced to transportation to the colonies. In other words, they were kicked out of England. And those who were captured, either Africans or Asians, who came as what we call slaves. So we think Richard was probably indentured to a ship's captain who then sold that indenture contract to a local plantation owner after his arrival in Maryland. Here's an indenture that still exists in the archives of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. This is dated 1784, that is after the Revolution, and it shows that James Bracken, who was a linen weaver from Ireland, agreed to serve a 4-year term as an indentured servant in Virginia for Enoch Stickney. Well, he might have bargained for 2 years, but if you can see closely, it might have been changed from 2 to 4 years. In exchange for his services in Virginia, the contract promises Bracken passage to Virginia on the ship Washington, sufficient meat, drink, apparel, lodging, and all other necessities befitting such a servant. And then, of course, he gets freedom at the end of his years of service. Bracken signed this with an X, indicating he probably couldn't read or write. And in the upper part, it says that Enoch Stickney was probably the master of the ship Washington. That is, he's the one who contracted and recruited Mr. Bracken, but then he sold the contract to somebody in Virginia when he got there, and that's how he made his money. I've looked into some immigration patterns, and in the middle Atlantic colonies in the 1700s, German immigrants were the ones who kind of filled in Pennsylvania, and the English were the ones who came to Maryland and Virginia. And this is important because we're talking about an a person of English descent, that is Reverend George, who was hanging out with a lot of German speakers, you see, so he's probably right there on the borderline. Well, here's how the Tarvins came to America. Here's George and his wife Marcia, who died in 1701, and the only surviving child of their 8 was Richard. Richard came by ship, sailed from Liverpool to Maryland, probably with his father. Here is Liverpool on a map. Let's zoom in. I'll show you how close it is to a little town called Tarvin, only about 35 miles. Now, today, there's nobody in the town named Tarvin because the surname probably originated when using the French abbreviation de Tarvin. People added that, meaning they're from Tarvin. So Richard would be de Tarvin, or at least his ancestor was Richard de Tarvin, meaning Richard of Tarvin, the village. So Richard Tarvin probably originated in the village. The surname was attached to it, to his ancestors when they moved away from the town. Well, here's where they landed, probably. Maybe through the port of Baltimore, but Charles County is where Richard ended up. So Richard Tarvin has now landed in Charles County, Maryland, probably had to fulfill an obligation under the indenture that he may have come on, but by 1719, he had married Elizabeth Dent. Well, this is interesting. Who is this Elizabeth Dent? Let's look at her parents. She's the daughter of William Dent and Anne Folk. And William Dent is one of the richest men in Charles County, Maryland. According to the book Dents in Maryland, few colonial squires lived in more style and elegance than William Dent, with his numerous slaves and white indentured servants on his several plantations. On one of those plantations, he built a house that he called the Friendship House. And that house is still standing, and you can visit it if you go to the campus of the community college in La Plata, Maryland. You'll be able to visit your ancestor, William Dent's Friendship House. Well, William and Anne actually had several children, a total of 9, including an earlier child who had died, whose name was Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Dent, our Elizabeth, was the second child in the family to carry that name. As you notice, several of these children died before William did. But before he died, he made a will to devise his property to his wife and 5 living children. His first son, Thomas, was the executor of that will. In that will, William Dent bequeathed to his little daughter, Elizabeth Dent, the lower plantation at Mattawoman of 500 acres, including Laurel Branch. She also received 5 Negro slaves, table linen, silver plate, household furnishings, and 1/2 the stock, that is the livestock on the plantation, plus several amounts of cash from his agents. Now it took over 20 years for the final accounting of the estate to be registered with the probate court. By that time, Elizabeth had married Richard Tarvin. Thomas reported to the court that the estate had paid out a legacy of £257, 18 shillings and 3 pence to Richard Tarvin, who had married a daughter. In today's funds, that would be worth over $70,000. Let's take a look at the rest of Elizabeth's pedigree in the New World. On both sides, on William's side and on Anne's side, the earliest ancestors came in the early 1600s. As a matter of fact, Anne herself is the granddaughter of Adam Thorogood, whose house is still standing in Virginia Beach, Virginia. This is a very interesting place to visit, and I did so in the late 1970s with my father, Vern Hoffman, and my daughter, Jennifer Hoffman, who are pictured here in this picture. This is in 2007, we held the Tarvin family reunion in Virginia Beach so that we could visit this house. after Richard and Elizabeth married, they had 9 children, and they proliferated in America. Let's talk about these children one at a time. These dates are approximate, and we might even have these children in the wrong order, but the first one we want to talk about is George Tarvin, and he married Eleanor Mudd and had 3 children, and they died fairly young, but the 3 children, Richard included in the 3, is possibly a Revolutionary War casualty. He was about the right age. George, of course, is the 3rd in the row, and he's Reverend George, who, of course, went to Western Virginia and then into Kentucky. And Nancy, Richard and George's sister, married a Benjamin Simpson, and they also moved into Kentucky, and were probably in communication with the Tarvins. So the Simpsons and the Tarvins were connected there. Well, that was Richard and Elizabeth's first child. The second one, Richard, died at about 22 years of age, and we have found his will, so we know of his demise. Martha Tarvin married a Joseph Noble, and they went into Pennsylvania and had 8 children in a place called Noblesville. 2 other children here. John, we don't know much about. Elizabeth may have married Basil Beale. They had 3 children, but I have other records that indicate that Basil Beale married somebody else. So that connection is somewhat tenuous. Then we have a child called William. William married Martha, and they had 7 children. This is the William Tarvin who moved from Maryland to Georgia around 1768. According to the records there, he arrived with a wife, 7 children, and 5 Negroes. Now, this branch of the family includes some very familiar patriarchs, such as William II, Richard Tarvin, known as Richard Tarvin, and a lot of his descendants are known by Tarvin. And George Tarvin is pretty prominent in Georgia, and it is possible that he is also the father of the branches that we recognize as Reddick, Churchwell, and William J. So here is how that branch of the family ties into the Tarvins, all the way back to William, who was the immigrant to Georgia, and Richard, who was the immigrant to America, and his wife Elizabeth Dent. After William, we have 3 others that we need to deal with. We don't know much about Thomas, but Anne and Rebecca apparently did not marry, and since they had inherited some of the estates from the Dents, they were the ones who looked after the estates there in Maryland, in Charles County. So this is the ancestry of Reverend George. This is the descendancy. Let's take a look at the descendancy the way Richard Johnston Tarvin showed it to us as a tree. And we will tack on the father of Reverend George, George Tarvin, and his grandfather, who was the immigrant. So the roots are definitely in England, but the roots go back 2 generations before we find the ancestor who immigrated. And that's what we know about the origin of the Tarvin family in America, and we'll talk about many of these branches in other videos. And so we can see Reverend George Tarvin's descendancy on the tree that Richard J. Tarvin had made, and we also discover his ancestry, George Tarvin and Richard Tarvin, who was the immigrant, the first Tarvin to immigrate to America, from whom we are descended. If you like this video, please click the like button, and to be reminded when new videos are released, please click on subscribe. We'll see you in another video talking about Tarvin history for the Tarvin Family Association.